Are you a home buyer or a home seller in the state of New Jersey? Well, you definitely want to watch this video because these three words can delay your closing for 8 to 12 weeks. Are you ready? Underground oil tank. Yes, scary, scary words. And there is a reason for it. Because unfortunately, finding an underground oil tank during the inspections could derail the entire closing date by let's
8
talk
to
about
12.
what is an oil tank? Why are they underground? At what point did we start putting them underground? At what point did we stop putting them underground? How do you find an oil tank? Whose responsibility is the removal of an oil tank? What does the process of removing an oil tank look like? Um, let's talk about all of this and more. So let's start from the beginning. What is an oil tank? Well, in the state of New Jersey, many, many years ago, one of the main sources of heat was oil fuel, which was delivered in trucks and pumped into oil tanks. And very often, those oil tanks were kept underground, not necessarily because the sellers were trying to hide them, but more because they were just huge. They were 1,000, 2,000 gallon oil tanks. Very often, there was just not enough space on the property or inside the home. So those oil tanks were kept underground, and it sounded like a great idea for many years. And then at some point in the mid 1900s, as the natural gas infrastructure throughout the United States grew, and homes started to transition from an oil heat to a gas heat source, these oil tanks often were no longer needed. So, what were the ways that you could potentially get rid of this oil tank? Well, you had one of three ways that they were dealt with. One, they were just left in the ground, forgotten, and just the way they were. Once the house switched over to gas, they cut the feeder lines and left them there like they didn't exist. Let's not think about it. That's really the worst case scenario. Most common is an oil tank that has been abandoned in place. And we'll talk about that one in great detail. The best case scenario, when the home transitioned from oil to gas, the oil tank was fully removed. So that's what we would always hope for. But because most likely the oil tank was abandoned in place or just abandoned, period, every single buyer, we always recommend that part of your many inspections that you will do on the home will be doing an oil tank sweep. And it's not just a scan with a metal detector. We recommend actually investing in a little bit of a more of a pricier test, which is the ground penetrating radar. And the reason that is the metal detector will definitely detect the metal structure on the ground. If it's a large oil tank, if it's an oil tank, period, it will pick up on that. But it's not going to give you a definite answer, generally delaying the process by until the next testing option comes in. So I would just skip to the next testing option, which is the ground penetrating radar. And that is a little bit of a more complicated test. It costs a little bit more money just because the machine is more expensive and it's bulkier. Not every inspector has those, but they basically scan the soil, the ground, and the property of the home, and they would be able to tell you if there's an oil tank under the ground, what size the potential oil tank is, and exactly where it is. So that would be the first step as a buyer, how you can make sure that the home that you're purchasing, if it does have an oil tank, that it's something that you find out immediately. And the reason you want to find out during the inspections um, is because in the state of New Jersey, the law is very clear. The removal of the oil tank, the responsibility of the removal of the oil tank is the seller's responsibility. So if you're a buyer, one of the ways that you're protecting yourself in a transaction is that you're making sure that you're not taking on this liability with the purchase of the home, right? But if you do find an oil tank, don't worry. The seller by law has to remediate, meaning they have to have the oil tank removed and they have to provide you with a clean, no further action letter, NFA, no further action letter, which takes 8 to 12 weeks to get from the state. And that's what ultimately will push the closing date out, right? Because very often in most municipalities and most counties, you will not be able to get a certificate of occupancy for the property with an outstanding NFA letter. So you would have to wait for that letter in order to close. And that's where things get really, really complicated. So let's talk about it. As a home seller, why you would want to get ahead of this issue? Well, if you're thinking about selling your home at any point down the line, right? Why have to deal with it then and delay your potential closing? If you know that there's an oil tank in the ground, let's take care of it now. If you're not sure where to start, please give us a call. We work with some really great, reputable companies in the state of New Jersey that we know and we trust, that treat our customers very fairly. And the most important part, they're super transparent during this process because it is an overwhelming process. Okay. So let's talk about what does the process ultimately look like. And I actually have videos here of a property that we recently had an oil tank removal done on. It's a 4-family home. So this oil tank is 2,000 gallons. It's enormous. It is 6 feet in diameter. This thing was in the front of the property. We could see the feeder lines going in. So we knew the oil tank was there, and the seller had decided to get ahead of the potential issue and have this remediation done prior to listing the home for sale. So we called an oil tank removal company. They came in with the radar and they scanned the property and they told us the size of the property. At that point, I'm sorry, the size of the oil tank and that it needs to be removed. The removal of an oil tank means that the company is going to the municipality. They're applying for permits, which unfortunately takes from 1 to 6 weeks, depending on the municipality and how backed up they are with their system and with their permits. Once the permit for the removal is issued, the company will schedule a removal date to make sure that they have access to the inside of the house so they can confirm a couple of things. Before they come out to removal, they have to make sure the gas company comes out and marks for the gas line so they avoid the gas line, because that's a whole other disaster. Nobody wants to ever accidentally hit a gas line. So that has to get marked out first, and then that takes a little bit of time as well. Once the oil tank removal company comes out, they will come out with a lot of machines. There's a digger. There's usually helpers coming in. It's a production for sure. And they come out and basically start opening up the soil wherever the oil tank we know already is. And they're really good at trying to avoid your hedges and the walkways, but unfortunately, that's part of the process. Your landscaping will take a beating, right? And sometimes it's a complicated. If you have extensive landscaping, it could be also a complicated removal for sure. So the machines get in there, they remove the whatever amount of soil over the top of the oil tank to get their access to the oil tank. Once they have access to the oil tank, and this particular oil tank that we're using as an example today, this oil tank is abandoned in place, meaning that when the house was transformed from an oil tank to a gas heat, from an oil heat to a gas heat, they basically cut open the top of the oil tank, emptied out of whatever leftover oil that was in there as much as they could. Obviously, it's really difficult to do oil, just because it's oil. And then they filled up an oil tank with rocks. So sometimes it's rocks, sometimes it's sand, sometimes it's combination of both. But the idea is that it was emptied, cleaned up as much as possible. They covered it with the piece that was removed, and it was abandoned in place, left there, not to think about, right? Since then, the laws have changed, and that's no longer an acceptable way to deal with an oil tank. It now has to be completely removed. So this oil tank, once they emptied out all the rocks from it, the oil tank was nudged out of place. It fell back a few times, but once they removed it, we were able to, and you can see as it's being removed, the amount of water that has been collecting inside this oil tank. Because for years, for the last 30, 40 years, every time it rained, it was just a big basin that would collect water. So obviously, rust is very common. It is the strongest metal possible. You can see how thick this oil tank walls are. But because of years and years of just water sitting in there, rust is going to happen. And this is exactly what happened with this oil tank. You can see it very clearly, has a hole in it, the water's pouring out of it. And the inspector came on site and unfortunately failed us, meaning that you could see that there's clearly holes. It was leaking. So if there was any oil left over, it leaked out into the soil. And that's the second part of this process called remediation. And that's really the biggest difference between the oil tank removal and an oil tank remediation, right? So now that we know that there's holes and the oil tank removal has basically failed, right? So now samples are being taken right from under the oil tank, and that sample is being sent to the lab. And the lab will measure the amount of contamination, the amount of oil in the soil. Once we have those results, with those results, they will tell us exactly how much remediation is ultimately necessary to fix this problem, right? Um, it could be anything from one truck full of soil, two truckfuls of soil, which will be a couple of $1,000s. We have unfortunately seen cases where the contamination was pretty severe and it made it to the neighbor's property and under the neighbor's foundation. So that required a lot more money. I guess one of the worst case scenarios, if the oil contamination has reached underground waters, because we have so many underground rivers in the state of New Jersey and lakes and streams. If you had a lot of oil left over in your oil tank when it was abandoned in the soil, and that has since been leaking into a stream, just imagine how fast that contamination, that poisoning of the soil would happen. And as a home seller, it's very much your responsibility to have it removed, right? So that's pretty much the worst case scenario. But once the lab results are back, which takes about a week to 10 days, and the oil tank removal company will schedule the remediation. At that point, you should know the price of what your remediation will cost, because it will basically be whatever the cost of removing the contaminated soil will be, right? Um, the oil tank company will schedule a remediation day where they come in with bigger machines and they just dig up all the soil that needs to be replaced. They replace it with a clean soil. And now they send the results to the state, and now we're waiting for the NFA letter, right? The letter of no further action, meaning that the state is satisfied with this remediation. They have no other concerns. They have no questions to this home seller or the future home seller of the property. And that's what every buyer wants. They want that NFA letter because it makes them feel better. It makes them understand that they're not taking on this problem as a liability. What's the average price of a removal of an oil tank? I mean, as of today, probably $2,000 to $4,000, depending on on who you're working with and where. I always say when it comes to this, just like everything else, don't look for the cheapest company. Look for a reputable company. This is a huge, tremendous liability, so you want to make sure that this is done really, really well. And once again, if you're not sure who to trust, please reach out. We work in the state of New Jersey. This is all we do. So in conclusion, an oil tank, yes, underground oil tanks, scary words, but by no means do they need to kill a deal. As a home seller, we highly, highly recommend that you get ahead of this problem and you have this remediated and removed prior to going for sale. So this way there are no unpredictable delays to your timeline and you can start freely planning your next chapter. If you found this video helpful, if you found this kind of information helpful, if you have any questions about real estate or oil tank removal, please comment below. If there's any other topics that you want us to cover, please comment below as well. We love to provide value and bring you interesting information. Thank you guys. We'll see you in the next video.